All right, so we're a little past 7, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all again for joining us this evening. I think as we all know, the mind can have an incredible influence on what we do in our sport. And I cannot think of a better person to learn about this topic from. Dr. Lennie Waite earned her PhD in psychology. She's a certified mental performance consultant, is a sports psychologist working with athletes of a range of ages and levels. I think she is an especially amazing person for track and field athletes to learn from because she herself is an Olympic athlete, representing Great Britain in this steeplechase in 2016. So I think there is a ton to learn here, and I know I'm really looking forward to this presentation. So you can take it from here.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Amanda. It's really great to be here, and I'm gonna dive right in. I really hope that people have questions, so feel free to put questions in the chat. Amanda, you can monitor those, right?
Yep.
And we'll leave some good time for questions. And I guess I'm gonna dive right in and share my. So Amanda gave a little bit of an introduction, and I'm going to kind of lay the foundation of how I grew up in the sport of track and field, and then a little bit into my transition from being the competitive athlete to actually then kind of being the support staff and working on the sidelines for the next generation of competitive athletes trying to make an Olympic Games. So a little bit about me. I started running when I was really young. I was the youngest of 4, and so it was cheaper for my parents to just sign me up for the race than it was to get me a babysitter, and my older sisters all ran. I didn't always love running, and this is always something that's very important for me to remember, especially when I work with youth athletes. I think it's very rare to find athletes who are like, yes, like please sign me up for the 2 mile or the mile at that younger age. And I was definitely one of those athletes who struggled with performing and especially the mental side of performance and enjoying track when I was in high school. I tried to quit a lot. Luckily, my coaches and my parents always kind of pushed me to that start line for long enough. And I started to get a little like so much, pressure and just didn't love it enough that I actually ended up having opportunity to play soccer and run track in college. And I actually chose to take that soccer scholarship. So I went to Rice University to play soccer. Luckily, the track coach recruited me off of that soccer field because he saw a lot of potential in me, and ended up having a pretty long and successful professional career as a steeplechaser. And I share this journey because, so many people think that this kind of path of performance is linear, and maybe there aren't these like mental struggles or this kind of fight with like, do you love the sport or do you not? And I definitely identify with that and definitely think it's normal, and are just very thankful that the right person at the right time in my life saw some talent. So when I was finishing up at Rice, I got a little bit better each year that I was running, to the point where my coach said, hey, there are some races over in Europe. I think you're good enough to go over there and run. So I told my parents about that, and they said, that's great, but you're not like, what else are you going to do? You're not just going to be this professional athlete. So I did my PhD at the University of Houston and continued training at Rice, and actually finished my PhD in 2012, finished 4th in the Olympic trials that year, so just missed out. Decided to commit and train for 4 more years and kind of achieve that Olympic dream in 2016. Now that's the very short version of my story in sports. And so, of course, I had a lot of very windy roads, moments of brief retirement, moments of questioning the purpose of running, definitely moments where I think my favorite moment of kind of insanity was when I yelled at my coach, telling him that if he wouldn't have made me so good, I wouldn't have this passionate battle with this sport that I loved and hated, which is always kind of an interesting story that I love to tell to my athletes when they get very frustrated. And so definitely understand a little bit of the passion and what goes into the sport, and then studied it from that psychological perspective as well when I was doing my PhD, and became really passionate with then helping that next generation of athletes really work with their mental performance. So I was a steeplechaser. I'm sure. I mean, I was talking to, I'm sure, hopefully, a bunch of people who are track geeks, kind of like myself. So I love the steeplechase as an analogy to mental preparation, because the steeplechase is just one of those events where there are actually literal barriers in the event, which makes this great analogy for how are you dealing with the mental barriers that are coming up throughout sports, right? So some of them are really challenging. And I like to use that analogy of the water pit, where you fall on the other side and kind of no matter what you do, you're going to get wet and you're going to struggle through it. But hopefully over time you can perfect that art and look really beautiful over those barriers. And so just like you're navigating 35 barriers in a steeplechase, you're literally navigating so many mental barriers in your track and field performances. And this is, you know, some of the barriers that I navigated, kind of losing races, winning races, crying after races, joying after races. And I share these images because if you think about sports in general, sometimes we underestimate the emotional demands that are on an athlete in a sporting arena. And it doesn't have to be a professional athlete to feel these types of emotions when you're thinking about sport. When you think about the amount of time that an athlete puts into something, the passion that they have for it, the training that they have, and the expectations that they have, that kind of level of emotionality can put them off kilter and can hurt their mental preparation. So it's really the mental preparation that I feel is really kind of balancing some of those emotional aspects of sport, of wanting it so much, of feeling so much pressure, of balancing the correct amount of training so that you can have those moments that you are really successful in. So one of the things that I've become aware of in my time in working in the field of sports psychology, and I actually chaired the USA Track and Field's sports psychology subcommittee, so was in charge of doing all of the tiered athlete programming, which basically applies to athletes top 25 in the world. They have access to these free sports psychology resources, and how do we connect with them? How do we get them to engage in these resources? And then how do we actually help their performance? And one of the biggest things that has become apparent, and I'm sure that people here watch the Olympics understand that athletes are bringing like not only sports psychology, but mental health and mental preparation to the forefront of their performances in general. From being a practitioner, there's still a huge gap in people's expression of wanting to engage in a relationship with a sports psychology professional and actually signing up for a meeting and going for that engagement. So there are probably many athletes who are thinking, oh yeah, it would be cool to work with a sports psychologist. It'd be cool to work on like the mental performance, but what's the step to actually starting that relationship and getting them to put in the work? And although we've made progress, there still is some stigma in sitting down and really spending time gaining the self-awareness on what are your weaknesses in a competitive environment, in a higher pressure environment. How potentially is your mind working against you, and how are we going to get it to work for you? So when I'm starting to work with new athletes, and I'll post the questions here, people can use the raise your hand function, or they can put yes in the chat. I feel like it's always a good idea to get people's brains going on like, what exactly is sports psychology and what are we trying to do as sports psychology professionals, and how are we helping mental preparation? So a basic question that I ask, has the pressure of competition day ever impacted your performance? Positively, or I would say potentially. In my field, we focus more on when that pressure of that competition day really impacts performance, potentially negatively. People can put it in the chat or raise their hand. Does your mind ever wander from your goals and focus on the negative when things start getting tough? So, you know, you have this great plan on maybe how to execute race performance or something that you're trying to do. And then suddenly it's like, oh man, this is like harder than I thought, or like my competitors are more tough, and it gets very challenging. And then a third question, Do you let fear or uncertainty hold you back from reaching your goals? So the potential of the unknown, of what might happen in the competition, of maybe just not being in full control when, you know, that's the beauty of competition. Sometimes that fear can be inhibitive of really reaching your goals. So, and have you ever felt like your emotions have gotten in the way of your performance, whether it's a bad day at work or even a really great day, and just kind of that emotional arousal that you're feeling is potentially distracting you from optimizing your performance on that day? So we have these questions here. And oftentimes, you know, people will think, yeah, you know, a couple of those apply to me. I see here that some people have put yes, maybe a couple of people are like, no, that hasn't happened to me. Like, very good for you. Mentally tough and able to kind of persevere through some of those mental demons. But I would say this is a great list to look at and think, no matter how many hours you spend out on the track, or how much more physical training you do, how many more weight lifting sessions or speed sessions you do, you're really not getting at the core of the root of these problems, which is really in between your ears. So what's happening to your mind? This all has to do with the appraisal of a situation, of your emotional regulation, of your ability to focus, of potential expectations that you're putting on yourself. And those aspects are not fully addressed until you actually take the time and slow down and think about what makes me tick as an athlete and what mentally do I need to reach optimal performance. And so these are all, I would say, very common issues that I work with athletes, and questions that I ask to get them to understand what's the importance of that mental preparation. So what makes great performances? I think it's easy to say that, you know, a ton of training, a lot of talent, but then we also pull out these other characteristics. We think about things like dedication, grit, perseverance, talent, which is more of that kind of genetic, born with factor, things like drive and motivation, resilience, hard work, purpose, passion, mental toughness. And this list isn't exhaustive, but there are so many things on this list that are related to the mental side of sports that are, I feel like, stones that remain unturned for many athletes, where they have, where they're leaving potential performance gains on the table. And when you kind of think about what characteristics do I have and what am I focused on in my training, oftentimes people jump to, like the number of miles they're running, the number of hours they're spending training, but they oftentimes forget of these underlying, like, the social, emotional, behavioral function that really leads to peak performance. So to be great at anything, performers, and even in track and field, they need to dedicate themselves to their goals. So, of course, a fundamental element of sports psychology is working on some of those goal setting elements. They need to work hard, especially in the face of adversity. And this is one of my favorite quotes that I have been using with a lot of athletes, I would say, especially some of the younger athletes recently, is this idea that talent meets trauma. And people probably have different backgrounds. I'm not sure how many people here are actually coaching athletes themselves, maybe both. But one thing from observing a lot of youth training is a little bit of fear of really pushing to push kids to the edge to face that adversity to where they actually have to grow. So as a sports psychologist, my role is not to try to make people never feel distress or never feel frustrated or angry. It's to help them recognize those emotions and try to grow from them. So in order to really build as an athlete, you need to sometimes push yourself to the point where you feel like you might break down. Sometimes you need to recognize that there are sacrifices that need to be made. You need to understand where those growth opportunities are, and have this really good balance of really stressing yourself, challenging yourself, dealing with some of the distress of the sport, and then growing from it. which is a little bit gets back to that, success is really swirly and squiggly. And I actually truly believe in people have to ride the roller coaster of performance to really understand the true mentality that it takes to be great. They also have to believe in themselves, their surroundings, and this last one, their individual path. So one of my really driving philosophies as a sports psychology practitioner is that there's no single answer for anybody. So athletes always like to be like, what should my routine be before a race? And my question is, well, like, what kind of performer are you? Are you somebody that tends to go into a race like a little bit too lackadaisical, or are you somebody that tends to go into a race with a little bit too much anxiety? Are you somebody that, at a meet, you really feed off of the energy and the flashing lights and the noise of the arena and the loudspeaker? Or are you somebody who would actually perform best when the track was empty and it was just you and a timer? And if you think about what makes people tick and their individual personality characteristics, they differ massively. So I bet you in this room, we have some people who are probably very, very relaxed, maybe some people who have a little bit more worry and anxiety, probably have some people who are extremely extroverted and they love nothing more than a big group run, and maybe some people who are more introverted who really thrive in that isolated training environment. Now, the skills needed to get that person to the start line performing their best are different. And there are potential dangers when you try to do what works for your teammate or what works for the person that you follow on social media, because you're undermining your own individual personality characteristics and in trying to kind of almost take a shortcut to get to what you feel like you need to do to do your best. With that being said, there are these core traits that you see across great performers across sports that I think are really important that I'm going to highlight, and I'll come back to these again at the very end. So full focus, the ability to connect with, attend, and focus completely on the appropriate elements when necessary. And if you've competed yourself, you're probably thinking, oh yeah, those great performances that I've had, it's like been really zoned in, didn't even hear the crowd or my coach cheering, maybe felt a little bit of that flow state on some of those like less great days. You hear everything, you're distracted. It's very hard for you to narrow in on what your performance goals are. Positive images. So the ability to experience or re-experience feelings, sensations, actions, or skills that are essential for the desired performance. Positive images is like a mental skill that you can work on daily. You can work on in training. You can really use that visualization. Mental readiness, so that ability to consistently create, adjust, and carry the most effective mental state into a performance situation. And this is that idea that to truly have mental readiness, you have to have a little bit of that self-awareness of actually, what is my optimal performance state? And is it like what you read in the textbook about like being amped and being aggressive, or is it like being relaxed and zoned in? And those things can be very different for that individual. But that mental readiness component means that you know how to get yourself there at the right time. And I think one of the biggest things in working with athletes is like, it's still a little bit of a gamble of like, I don't really know if I'm going to be in my race ready mode. And so how do you create a routine that allows you to think, I've checked these like 3 boxes, and these 3 boxes get me into my mental readiness zone and it make me feel like I'm ready for an effective performance. Distraction control, which really, in my opinion, ties into that first one of that ability to focus, but to maintain and regain appropriate focus, even when there are obstacles or feedback. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the presentation, but when we go into a race situation or a competitive environment, or even in life in general, really, we know what types of barriers might pop up to derail us from our performance goals. But it takes really working with, I think, a sports psychology professional or being very deliberate to think, hey, if this barrier pops up, how am I going to respond? A lot of people have this instinct to say, well, I hope everything just goes smoothly. But in life, when does everything go smoothly? Very, very rarely. So if you almost have this, it's almost like this goal setting where you're picturing the potential common barriers that are coming up, and then also using those positive images to see yourself overcoming those barriers, going through maybe a little bit of self-talk to help you overcome those barriers in those more sticky performance situations. And then that constructive evaluation. So really looking back and drawing those lessons out of what you can get out of a future performance. And so a post-competition debrief is an extremely valuable element in terms of growing as an athlete. And it's not like these debriefs are obviously focused on positives. This is where it's very important to have process goals where regardless of actual like the performance or the outcome, so regardless of what time the athlete runs or where they place, hopefully there's some processes that you can debrief on and say, okay, this went really well. I was able to execute a start or able to run a portion of the race at my desired pace. And then also think, what are areas to continue to grow? Because as humans, we like momentum, we like to feel progress, we like to know that we're moving in the right direction, and this constructive evaluation can feed into that. So maybe some people have seen this formula before, E plus R equals O. I think my college coach definitely shared this with me, and it gives a little bit of insight into the importance of the cognitive appraisals and how people are processing and managing their performances really impact that overall outcome. So in this equation, we have that E that stands for event, that R that stands for response, and that O that stands for outcome. And in some ways, this is a just different version of a potential control the controllables dialogue. But I like this one because I think it really reminds athletes that the event is happening, right? Whether the event is the state meet or the national championships or the upcoming race, that is on the calendar and we know it is there and you're not going to change that. Typically at the end of the event, there is some form of outcome that has happened, and that is also very hard to change. But what you do have complete control of is that R, that response aspect. And this R, in my time kind of working with athletes, is what differentiates great athletes from maybe athletes who don't reach their full potential. So let's say, for example, you have the state meet, you have an underperformance. Some people might respond with, I underperformed, I'm upset, I'm sad, I'm going to skip training tomorrow. It's not even worth going. Like, what's the point? And they're going to kind of drag themselves out of the sport for a little bit because of that negative response. Well, they're missing valuable training time. They're missing the opportunity to learn from experiences. Whereas an opposite response would be like, man, I want to do that constructive evaluation and debrief with my coach or my sports psychologist. And I want to figure out like what pieces of the puzzle I have to put together and how I'm going to get back out there to meet my performance goals next time. So that person wakes up the next day, they do their training, they start putting in strategies to figure out how to close the gap of where they currently are and where they want to be. And it's that R factor that leads to the acceleration of that one athlete and the deceleration of that other athlete. So overall, you have to learn that you do not control events. And so when athletes, I feel like when they get anxious about an event like a meet or a situation, it's thinking you can't control that. Like that is free yourself from feeling the responsibility of that event. But you are responsible for your actions and you can learn effective behaviors for dealing with that. And in my field, I'm constantly trying to kind of put it back on the athlete, right? They're looking for maybe answers or they want help or they want someone to do it. But sports psychology is one of those things where it's like the more that you take ownership and autonomy over your own journey and recognize what you can control and what you don't control, the more success you're going to have, which is easier with collegiate and professional athletes than it is with youth athletes, but even starting to give youth athletes that little bit of sensation of like, hey, you actually have some say over what you're going to do, and you actually have some control over how you're going to respond. So you can kind of start teaching them those skills that become really important later on. I'm going to talk about navigating some barriers. And so this past year, gosh, there were a lot of barriers to navigate. So I'm going to pull some examples from some athletes that I worked with. COVID was a big one, right? For some people that became a huge issue, a huge barrier from their being able to perform. It became kind of the fixated reason for why they were going to underperform. Then I had some athletes who had this amazing response of like, what opportunity does this present to me? How can I train differently? How can I do things differently because I'm not able to travel as much. I'm not able to get to the track as much. What do I have access to and what can I do? Similar kind of, I'm going to play kind of the pros and the cons in each one of these situations. Similar with that empty Olympic stadium. This was where I really dug into how that athlete functions. So I did feel for some athletes, if they were really high on that excitement, that need for excitement seeking, really, really extroverted, just really needed like people to fill their battery and optimize their performance. There was no denying that an empty Olympic stadium, it was going to be a challenge for them. But there was a whole subset of people who are, not all athletes are extroverts. A lot of them are very, very introverted. A lot of them actually prefer the lonesome work at the track, and they were really able to get almost an extra performance benefit and explore that from this unique situation. And that was really fun to work on their mental prep and letting them know this actually isn't going to be a barrier for you. And then for the athletes that did need that excitement seeking, we just had to create it. So like, how can you get unique? How do you use pump up music, visualization, put yourself in intense situations to create that excitement that isn't naturally there? So there's always a solution if you're willing to work. Similarly, some people perform really, really well when there are like these external awards or these praise and other people don't. Regardless of which end of the spectrum you're on, there are going to be times when people are going to be there watching you, praising you, cheering you on. And how are you going to make sure you prepare for that? And similarly, there can be awards, and that can impact where an athlete puts their focus. And so if you're really only focused on that outcome instead of that process, that can become a barrier for you. You can kind of forget about the simple steps that you need to put in to get the reward, and you become fixated on the reward, which can undermine that performance. Yes, for some people, they are very, very externally motivated, and those awards help them. But I'm always under the impression that that's more of a short-term indicator of performance, and that really long-term sustainable performance comes more from those factors that are within. So overall, how you respond to challenges, the current environment, difficult situation is essential to achieving your goals and maximizing performance. And as that side note, when I'm working with athletes, it's always important to understand your personality and use your strengths to make the most of an event. So everybody has strengths somewhere. We all have vulnerabilities. And sometimes we are so focused on the vulnerabilities, like we're just kind of thinking like what kind of negative things might pop up. But if you know how you function and you can leverage your personality to allow yourself to really thrive in an environment, then you're going to actually hit your performance goals. So how can I improve my response to stress, underperformances, and frustrations? So a lot of dealing with mental preparation, like I said, is kind of keeping athletes making progress and on the path towards moving in that right direction. Sometimes people just get a little bit down. They use that emotion-focused coping of eating ice cream, or they bury their head in their computer, but obviously not productive. So how you think really impacts how you move your body. And this is a really basic psychology study that I like to apply to the sport of track and field. So In this study, they had these two groups of people. They had one group that were primed with words related to the elderly and a second group that was primed with more neutral words. That first group, both of these groups walked into a room and they sat down in a chair. People in group one they read a list of words: gray, related to the elderly; gray, wrinkle, Florida. This is a true study, and Florida was actually on that list. Group two read a list of neutral words: thirsty, clean, private. Then, unbeknownst to the participants, they timed how long it took them to leave that room. And what they found was that thinking about the elderly made group one walk significantly slower when they left the experiment than people in group two. So sometimes you're like, what does this have to do with anything performance related? And I just relate it back to, we all have these words that go through our head. We like wake up on competition day, I'm tired, I can't do it. Like maybe my throat is scratchy, like my legs are still sore from my last weight training session. If those are the messages that are naturally going through your head, you have to try to proactively shift it, because your like brain and body are interconnected, and those messages start to trickle down and negatively impact performance. Not saying that those things aren't going to come in naturally, but again, it's important to recognize that it's not helpful, and how can you shift that? So we have this innate way of maybe how we perceive the world. Some people maybe see things a little bit more negatively, and some people see things more positively. So for some people, maybe it's very easy to see how to shift this staying. And for some people, it might be hard. They might be reading it over and over again and thinking, wait, opportunity is nowhere, opportunity is nowhere. But when you can change your perspective and think, wait, opportunity is now here. You can shift to that more positive mindset, that more like, you know, let me kind of take on a challenge. Let me approach what I'm trying to do in a more proactive way. And that takes training, and it takes more training for some types of brains than other types of brains. So I'm going to just do like a quick soccer analogy. Also, I'm just going to, Amanda, how long should I talk and how long should I leave for questions?
So I think, you know, talking until 8 or so. If you need more time, feel free to take it.
Okay.
And then I think we had 4 questions or 4 or 5 questions pre-submitted.
Okay.
So I don't think those will take much more than 10 or so minutes.
Okay, great. Just making sure. I don't want you to be like, no, we have to wrap up by 8. Okay, so avoiding failure versus approaching success. Everybody here has heard people having that fear of failure, and I have athletes all the time that I work with, you know, what happens if I underperform? What happens if I don't make the Olympic team? What happens if I don't make the state meet? I'm thinking like, don't think about that. Let's like think about like, what are you trying to achieve? And let's put our energy into achieving that. So if you are a soccer fan, or even if you're not, I'm sure you've watched penalty kicks at some point in your life. And I love penalty kicks because somebody of any skill level can actually hit the ball on that target. And I think soccer players are the highest paid. They are the highest paid athletes in the world, also the most followed on Instagram, just because of the way that the world works. Yet some of them, even though they're paid a few $1 million a game, fail to hit this ball on target when they're given this really open opportunity. And it's like, they have all of the physical skills. What is happening? And it's this perfect situation of high pressure, high intensity, which kind of derails how our brain works. And their focus is on don't miss. So they're maybe saying to themselves, what could go wrong? Make sure you don't mess up, don't miss. And if your brain is thinking, don't miss, don't miss, don't miss, it's really latching on to that concept of the potential for missing, and it's causing inhibition. And whenever we're inhibited, we're physiologically not moving the way we're supposed to. You're probably in running, it means you're probably like maybe tight in the shoulders, not taking advantage of your full breath. In soccer, it means you're not actually allowing that full power of your leg to really make contact with the ball. Versus somebody else who is thinking more about what could go right, where's the opportunity, and giving themselves that direction of place the ball in the lower right-hand corner. And this is, I'm like a stickler for this now. Whenever I go through, like, what do you want to achieve in the race? Well, I don't want to get dropped, and I want to make sure that I don't get beat by Susie. And I'm like, oh no, those are all avoiding failure goals. And so I work with my athletes. How can we reframe that into something where you're trying to approach success? You're actually going after something you want to achieve instead of trying to prevent something bad from happening. And just that psychological shift gives people, okay, oh yeah, that's, I'm going to activate and I'm going to go after that. Instead, I'm going to stay tense and I'm going to be fearful and I'm going to try and avoid that. So if you ever notice that your athletes you're working with, or you yourself as an athlete, are really focused on avoiding that failure, then challenge yourself to flip that to how can I approach success and where is that opportunity? People ask me all the time, like, how do athletes stay motivated? And I have to update the answer to this question because I recently just did this study with 178 athletes who were at the Olympic trials, and 90 of them actually went to the Olympic Games. And I'm sure when you think about an Olympic athlete, you think, oh man, they must have like such they must be so motivated. That's actually not what we found. They're just kind of like just about as motivated and disciplined as like an everyday person. The thing that elite athletes have is an infrastructure that supports them. So they typically have a coach that makes sure they get to training. They have a nutritionist that makes sure that they're eating correctly. They have a sports psychologist that reminds them to do their mental skills training. Some of them live at the Olympic Training Center because they know they can maybe engage in some self-sabotaging behaviors. And so I just say this because it's not the norm to wake up and be like, man, I'm like raring to go every morning. Even people who are competing at the Olympics, they really struggle with the discipline that it takes to replicate that performance day in and day out. So the big thing though, in terms of thinking about motivation is your motivation, is this controlled motivation or is this autonomous motivation? And one of the things that makes elite athletes motivation sometimes harder is because a lot of it kind of starts to fall into that controlled motivation of like, I'm getting paid for this. This is part of my contract. This is like, so some of those reasons of like self-pursuit that they originally used are getting a little bit murky in that controlled motivation aspect. So that controlled motivation, performing for external rewards, gaining approval from others, feeling an obligation or pressure to produce behavior, oftentimes related to money, or in NCAA athletes, so scholarships. And that autonomous motivation, it's feeling that sense of choice, that personal endorsement, that interest in activity. They see satisfaction in the activity and can engage in better self-regulation of behavior. So it's really that key in where does that satisfaction component come in, and how do you continue to keep that satisfaction component in an athlete's life really long term? And I think this can shift throughout the decades of an athlete training. So what they originally enjoyed, as a kid, of just maybe the being outside, being with their friends, beating their friends, might shift to inspiring others, being a platform to show the community kind of what you can do with hard work. But keeping this autonomous motivation does require a little bit of soul searching, a little bit of finding purpose, and a little bit of finding meaning in order to stay motivated. So whenever you feel that dip in motivation, my suggestion is, why are you doing it? And oftentimes when you feel a dip in motivation, you start to think, well, I actually don't have an answer for that. And that's just a signal to take a step back and try to redefine what your goals are and what the journey means in the sport, instead of just kind of plowing through and hoping that it comes back. So all athletes get to really write their narrative, and a narrative of, I guess I do it because I have to, or I do it because I'm afraid what will happen if I don't, or I do it because somebody pays me, or because I got a scholarship to do it. That's not going to keep you successful for very long. But I do it because a greater purpose or a greater meaning, or like truly brings me satisfaction, or it's really intrinsically tied to my psychological health, or it's like kind of my social outlet. Those are meanings that allow those athletes to stay more motivated in that long term. Okay, now we're going to flip to how do my emotions impact my ability to fulfill my goals? So we all have basic emotions, and emotions are not a problem. So feeling happy, feeling sad, feeling angry, feeling anxious, feeling worried, none of that is like when an athletes are like, I'm worried about my emotions. I'm thinking, well, your emotions are fine because everybody has them and we should have them, and they're around for like a reason. Like we kind of just how we've evolved as humans. Emotions are very, very helpful. What's not helpful is to like over attach meaning or to allow your emotions to cause you unnecessary stress because they're not the emotions that you want. And so this is where I'm going to give this example because it's Winter Olympics season. And this is like, to me, one of the craziest Winter Olympic events. I think, you know, you kind of take this lonesome escalator ride to the top. You're sitting there in the chute, you're looking down, maybe you can see your parents waving the flag in the crowd. And it's really down to this one moment of, if I jump however many meters, I win gold. And if I don't, then I won't. And in that moment, it's probably very easy for that athlete to think about everything that might go wrong, all the training that they've put into it to kind of create this really emotionally heavy environment. Yet in order to maximize performance in that environment, they have to be completely detached from all of those emotions. They can't be thinking about where their parents are staying in the crowd or the amount of work that they put in. They have to be thinking very simply of, what am I trying to execute? And hopefully they've had a sports psychologist tell them, you need to stick to your 3 key performance indicators and you need to execute those, and then they'll be good. And so emotions are very healthy in life in general. Emotions in high pressure and high intensity situations tend to undermine our performance, tend to make it very challenging to execute like the simple physical skills that we've been working on. And you see it all the time. That's like exactly what happens when athletes choke, when athletes, you know, hit the last hurdle, when they're on their way to win gold, when they're going down the finishing straight and they just tighten up, even though that never happens to them. It's just all those emotions coming in because they're starting to engage in that emotional side of their brain, not focusing on that performance side, and that can undermine them. So in all sports, I feel like there is a good place to have a thinking box and there is a good place to have an action box. And that thinking box can be, you're going through maybe some of your emotions that are likely to pop up. You're going through how you're going to deal with those emotions. You're going through some of your worries, some of your concerns. And I always say, you know, sports psychology isn't always about just like staying positive and thinking about what's going to go right. It's going through realistically, like, what are you going to be thinking about on competition day? Are you going to be worried that you're going to like struggle to find a bathroom, that you're going to feel like you're going to throw up, that your friend is going to beat you, that you're going to underperform? Like, let's talk about that and let's get that out on the table. And then let's shift to like what we're going to actually work on so that you can have your best performance. And so there's a time to go through thinking about what to execute. And then for every athlete, I say, hey, we've spent the time, we've talked about the race strategy, we've talked about the plans, we've talked about the things that can go wrong. We've course corrected how, when those things go wrong, how you're going to respond to try to get them to go right. So every time when you're, you know, in those kind of that final hour, final few hours before your competitive event, and you feel yourself going back to that thinking box, let's go back to the 3 cues of what you're trying to execute. And let's have that playing on repeat. And let's try and get some of that thinking just a little bit quieter. And for some athletes, that's easier than others. And for some, it's like, you know, we create when you physically walk into the competitive arena for that warm up, that's when you're going into that action box. And so you have your list of things that you're doing, you're laying down on your mat, you're listening to your music, you're checking in for your race, you're going to the bathroom, you're putting on your spikes, and you're being very focused on the things that you're acting on, because as soon as you start thinking. It can be exhausting. It can spiral a little bit of worries, a little bit of anxiety. You're in that high pressure, high intensity environment. You don't think clearly in there. Nobody ever does. And so staying just course correcting on those actions. I'd say this is probably one of the most helpful things that athletes find is like, okay, let's stick to these list of actions and try and keep me performance focused in this environment. And so some of it has to do with effective goal setting to really prevent that emotional hijacking. So we write down these goals, but maybe I'm sure some people in here come from a distance running background, and that's what I come from. So I'm going to kind of tell it from that perspective of, you know, I was a steeplechaser, and, you know, I'd go in and I have these very specific goals of what I was going to do in the final kilometer. And suddenly the final kilometer would hit and my brain would be like, just slow down. You're really tired. Like, you'll get it. You'll hit the qualifying time next time. Like, today it's just too hard. You just have all of these thoughts that I felt like would pop up and try to like derail me from my goals. And it wasn't until I said, you know what, that's probably going to happen 2K into every 3K steeplechase, because this race is freaking hard. And if I am prepared to tell that little voice in my brain, hey, you need to like move out of the way, because I actually have this list of things that I'm trying to achieve right now, and do it very deliberately, then like you can stay on track. But it took me a long time to recognize, like, regardless of how much mental prep I did, if I didn't mentally prepare for that emotional hijack in every race and how I was going to respond to it, I wasn't going to get over it. And so that became a really effective strategy for me in that endurance situation. And just also gave me insight into recognizing that no matter what, when things get tough and challenging, you don't think clearly. And as long as you're prepared for that and you have an action plan, you can at least get pretty close to back on track. So this relates to a little bit of expect the unexpected. So you've trained really well, you're really fit, your training indicates that you should throw a certain mark or jump a certain distance or run a certain time, but that's not how competition works. They still throw all those barriers at you right in the middle. And when you can really be prepared for those challenges, and you can balance kind of the challenges with the resources that you have, not only are you like mentally healthy, but you're also performance ready. And so for athletes, I always encourage them to talk to other athletes, coaches, and support personnel to like who've been in the game to learn what to expect. And it's always shocking to me when like youth athletes are so confused about the adversity that some of these like long-term athletes have faced. And that educational component and normalizing those challenges can be really, really helpful, without being like a Debbie Downer or telling people like, oh man, you're going to run into a brick wall at some point in your career if you're in this sport for long enough, which I have to stop myself for saying, because I think it is, I mean, at some point everybody has that kind of dip in performance. But really preparing athletes for dealing with unexpected events, things like injuries, weather delays, bad pacers, all of these things are likely going to pop up. And if we use like, oh, I hope that things go well as a strategy without actually kind of doing some contingency planning of what does this race look like if your promised pacer who said they were going to go out in a 60-second 400 actually goes out in a 55-second 400. And this kind of planning just helps athletes be more prepared for those multiple situations. Having an optimistic yet realistic attitude. So there's a difference between like, some people will call like toxic positivity of like, I can do it no matter what. Well, I mean, they're probably like something that might happen that like, maybe you won't be able to do it. So I'm always like, let's err on like, what are your goals? How are you going to approach them? How are you going to be proactive in like getting what you want, but also like what events might pop up and how are you going to manage those stressors either at a meet or in a race situation. And focus most on what will help you reach your goals and perform your best. So we all have kind of these thoughts that go through our minds. And I always challenge athletes to say like, is the thought that you're having right now helpful? And if the answer is no, which oftentimes it's not, like what is the most helpful thought that you could have right now? And how do we shift away as quickly as possible from unhelpful thoughts to some more of those helpful thoughts? So this is just in general, when we look at how emotions can help performance. They did this study back in the day where they had participants watch a movie with a pencil in their mouth between their teeth that made them grin, or between their lips that made them frown. And in general, people who watched the movies smiling found them much more enjoyable, laughed much more, rated the experience as much more pleasurable than people who did it while frowning. And this is like so simple, but it just kind of taps into the importance of body language, and the importance of actually, there are a few things that you can do that will help you just see things in a little bit more of enjoyment and a positive way. I always use Usain Bolt and Kipchoge as examples of people who use that positive emotion of kind of happiness to pull out their most optimal performances. I mean, people may think that Bolt is just, kind of, banter person, but I think that he's very strategic in how he uses his emotions to actually facilitate his most optimal performance. And similarly with Eliud Kipchoge, I think he's so self-aware that running from that place of happiness pulls out his most optimal performance, that there are ways to leverage some of those positive emotions to facilitate performance. And, in general, everybody has their kind of different optimal zone of performance. So some people are overly anxious, and we're trying to, those the athletes who were doing like, let's do some box breathing before an event, let's do a brief body scan, let's remember that mom and dad will still love you whether you win or lose. And then there's some athletes who I'm thinking like, hey, let's get fired up. You need to get to the start line, and being able to recognize that and try to use their emotions to get them into that right zone, just to help them perform the best that they can. So overall, that emotional awareness and insight into your emotions can impact your ability to achieve your goals and essential to success. And in regards of emotions, I always say it's best to practice acceptance over control. So there's a famous sports psychologist, and she said, the trouble to be without distress is the problem, not the presence of these thoughts and feelings. So when I stated at the beginning, like, it's fine for athletes to experience distress. They need to experience distress at various stages of their career to actually progress to the next stage of their career and grow. They need to work through that. They need to experience a little bit of adversity. And recognize that those things in themselves are not damaging. It's sometimes like how much they struggle to like get out of that feeling and try to get it away that can be more damaging. And I'll kind of end with this. And some of you, if you're a geek like me and are a reader of David Epstein's The Sport Gene, he tells this great story of these two high jumpers. And I like to end with this because this is really central to my philosophy of approaching the individual and like getting to know that individual to support their performance, instead of saying like, these are 5 things that you have to execute. Like, you need to go through a brief muscle relaxation, you need to do a centering exercise, and you need to, like visualize winning. Those 3 things might work for some people, maybe not for another person. So in this story, we have Donald Thomas and we have Stephen Home. So on your left, Stephen, he started high jumping at like very, very young age. He had a high jump pit in his backyard. He got better every single year. He never had a girlfriend because the high jump was his girlfriend. He won gold at the 2004 Olympics, best in the world. Then we have Donald. Donald came to the US to go to play basketball. And he was at a junior college playing basketball, and he was making fun of the track and field participants, saying that like, track isn't even a sport. I bet you I could probably high jump higher than you, like right now. So the basketball players were like, okay, let's go to the gym and let's see it. And I guess they started raising the bar until Donald was about to break their school record in his sneakers, in his basketball sneakers and his basketball shorts. And so they were like, hold up, we got to go get our coach if you're like legit going to jump over this. And he cleared it. And I think the next year he competed at the Commonwealth Games. And then he ended up facing Stephen at the World Championships. And they were going bar for bar, and Donald ended up winning off of a couple years of training. People were really digging into him because look at his form. He looks sloppy, he looks messy. And as soon as he won that world championship, everybody said, you know, if we could actually get him to jump like Stefan in terms of the technical approach, maybe he could get the world record. So they started tweaking his training and training. And he didn't jump better. And people have kind of dug into why with like increased training, did he not improve when we feel like kind of physiology and training techniques would dictate improvement? Well, it's because there are individual elements that are important to both of these performers that sometimes we overlook when we try to go to a one-size-fits-all model. So my kind of take-home point is that authenticity and focus on your individuality is at the core of sustaining your best level of performance. So if you can create a performance pathway and engage in like mental strategies and mental skills that are most authentic to yourself, match your personality, and make you feel like you don't have to change to be great, then you're going to not only have good performances, but also be able to sustain those performances over time. I'm going to kind of go through. So overall, I just wanted to finish with these last kind of going through these 5 elements. Like I said, these are themes, but are potentially manifest differently in athletes depending on what makes them tick, who they are as people, what resonates with them in each one of these elements. But that's that focus, those positive images, that mental readiness, that distraction control, and that constructive evaluation. And then lastly, I just want to make sure people know my certification is my PhD in psychology. I'm a certified mental performance consultant. And if anybody's ever interested in seeing like, hey, I wonder if there's someone in our area that can like work with me or work with some of the athletes that I work with on some of these performance cues, there is a registry of certified mental performance consultants who are really trained in helping you gain that mental focus and performance through that Association of Applied Sports Psychology. If you go to their website, you can find a consultant in your area, kind of learn more about how CMPCs, how these certified mental performance consultants are trained. And that's it. So that's my email address up there. You can even have my phone number if you want to follow up. Maybe not with a phone call tonight, but down the line. And I'm happy to answer some questions now.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. I think I speak for everyone here in that I learned a lot and I found a lot of your perspectives very, very interesting. So we do have some questions. I think we've got 5 questions right now. And if you wouldn't mind staying to answer those, I think people would definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm going to stop my share.
So our first question has to do with nervousness before a race. But what is a good mentor or way to combat race nervousness? Maybe there's something to do in training that could help quell that race day anxiety. Also, for a long race, such as a marathon, what can you do to stay focused during those last 3 to 4 miles?
Okay, so I'll address the nervousness side first. So I think, first of all, every athlete experiences nerves, and it's really normalizing that. And instead of fighting it, and I think I see a lot, it's like athletes know race day is coming, they know they're going to get nervous, and they don't want it to happen. And I'm like, it's going to happen. You're passionate about what you're pursuing. You have big goals. That is a recipe for nervousness. So first of all, let's work a little bit on your appraisal of what it means to be nervous. It's not necessarily bad. It's fine, and let's accept it. And let's think about you are just a super passionate person who cares a lot. And this is where you're going to be. Now, with that being said, of course, there are times where I've worked with athletes that are so nervous that they're throwing up on the start line or they're making themselves hyperventilate. Not productive. So that's where you really have to work on how, I would say, some basic box breathing. So some basic inhale, hold, exhale, hold. So really putting these things into their pre-performance routine as they're warming up that are at least going to lower some of those physiological symptoms that come up as a consequence of that anxiety. Maybe just doing a brief body scan and purposely trying to slow things down. The point about, in practice situations, can you make things like more high stakes? I mean, trying to create realistic training environments that mimic competitions, it's always helpful when you can do it, but it's always challenging. People are smart enough. They know that like those results aren't actually going to get posted. It's not going to impact their ranking, but you can add elements of that in. Even if it's just like, hey, we're going to do like the rep starts at this time. Everybody needs to be on the start line. Like there's, not as much flexibility. You maybe add some kind of like a check-in component. You maybe wear your uniform. You can add some elements that can give them that little bit of like race day feel to help them manage in a safer environment and kind of shift them closer to be able to transfer those skills to a competitive environment. Then in terms of the marathon question, this is great because, this is one of those things that like, is probably going to happen in every marathon. Like, the final few miles are going to be pretty awful. You're going to lose focus. And this is like, if you can like kind of pick a point or a mile marker where, that's going to happen. And you can say, hey, I'm leaning into this uncomfortable thing that's happening to me, my desire to get distracted. I'm recognizing that it's like right here and it's hitting me in the face and I'm going to like run through it anyway. So you almost kind of plant the demons along the final miles. And instead of letting them like come and hit you in the face, you like almost punch them in the face. And I've actually worked on this technique with athletes before who've been like, at mile 17, this always happens. So I'm like, hey, at mile 16 and a half, just start like punching that person away. Like, it's coming. Don't let them come. And then when it comes, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. It's like, it's not as bad because I'm like more prepared and I've like kind of embraced that like acceptance approach. And I have an action to engage in to get me through that segment.
All right. Thank you, for sharing that advice. So our next question also has to do with a specific event, but is for the steeplechase. So what mentor do you use when feeling fatigued at the end of a steeplechase race?
Sorry, what mental tip?
Yes.
Gosh, I mean, feeling fatigue at the end of the steeplechase, you didn't do right if you don't feel fatigued. And I think for me personally, and this is like, again, I'm going to get back to like, this has to do a little bit with that person's wiring. If I stayed just relaxed and stayed really focused one barrier at a time, I was able to get over them. When I started thinking about how many more barriers were in this lap, I swear they got taller and taller. So it became a very deliberate practice of me, like staying where my feet were, like looking down at my feet, thinking about one barrier at a time. And if I was able to master that in a race, which even when I was competing at the Olympic level, I couldn't master with 100% effectiveness, but the races where I cleared those barriers fine, because each one is not the problem. It's the anticipation of all of them that are ahead of you. And then it's like this mental trick of they've gotten like a few inches taller towards the last lap.
Okay, thank you. That was a very interesting perspective. So we have two questions that have to do with different age groups. So the first is, have you found any unique aspects to mental preparation for masters athletes?
I'd say from like the more mature athletes that I've worked with, masters level athletes, the mental preparation somewhat depends on their history in the sport. So if they're coming from a rich sporting background or they're not, and if they come from a rich sporting background, it's like, they know a little bit more about like what makes them tick and what performances are good and bad. And for those athletes, it's almost like helping them kind of refrain and get to the point in their career that potentially increased training or even the same training isn't going to lead to like the same historical results. So really working on managing some of those expectations and what that career trajectory looks like as a master's athlete, redefining what success looks like, because there does come a point, especially if you've been in the sport, if you're a master's athlete, you've been in the sport from a young age, where that performance trajectory is not going to pay off in the way that you want it to. And it's like, it's important to tackle that, to talk through it, to kind of voice the frustrations, but then find some of those silver linings. And then I'll say there are other masters athletes who get into the sport very late. And because they didn't grow up in the sport, they sometimes have this misconception that like, oh, I'm not that athletic, or I'm not supposed to be that good at it. And for them, it's like the opposite of really reframing, like, you're really, I would say from the masters athletes that I work with, like they're really effective in their jobs. The way that they walk into their work environment, like they're kick butt lawyers, or they feel like they can take control of that boardroom, but they're like, oh, like I've trained for this marathon, but I really don't think I'm going to hit my goal. And I'm thinking, would you ever walk into a case that you're defending with that attitude? Or would you ever walk into a boardroom with that attitude? And trying to tear down some of these conceptions that they have about being like unathletic or not great at that sport because they are new to it, and they're competing against all these people who were in college. And so those are two different cases, and that just shows that it really depends on the masters athlete's background and where they're going in the sport.
Right, wonderful, thank you. So our other question that has to do with a specific age group is on middle schoolers, or on kids in general. So how do we address mental pressure when kids are switching age group? And then how do you treat the performance of middle school kids?
This is a great question. I'd say middle school is a very challenging age, and it's challenging because that self-awareness aspect, which I feel is like very central to really understanding how to maximize your performance. Like they don't fully have it, right? So they know like a little bit, but they don't know enough. And then also parents are very, very challenging for middle school kids. So regardless of what you as a coach can tell them, or me as a sports psych can tell them, you don't know what mom and dad are telling them at home that may or may not be true. Regardless of that, this is like definitely a phase where you're really trying to emphasize enjoyment, process, growth over those performance outcomes. And they will latch to those performance outcomes. And it's just a continual reminder of you're in 8th grade. And for me, I always kind of use the example of like, I didn't even steeplechase until my 5th year of college. So don't tell me that like your performance in your 7th or 8th grade year is actually going to dictate your trajectory in this sport. But they don't have the kind of forward-looking vision to believe you. So instead, it's just the constant reminder of like, hey, like, what did you do at let's think about what you did last year and let's look at what you're doing this year. And let's like, are you having this trajectory of performance? Are you still enjoying it? Do you feel like this is something that you want to do for a long time? And it's kind of the balance of pushing them and motivating them enough so that they don't withdraw from the sport, but making sure you're really not putting them at risk for burnout.
All right, thank you. So those are some very interesting thoughts about 2 different age groups. So our last question has to do with coming back from an injury. But if an athlete is coming back from an injury and they've kind of been cleared physically to do something, but they're about to do that same task that initially got them hurt, how can you support their mental performance and their mental preparedness? And also, what can that athlete do to make sure that they're prepared mentally to perform that task again?
This is like such a great question and so relevant. I was given a lecture for a group of orthopedic fellows earlier today, and we were going through some of the research of one of the biggest predictors of an ACL re-tear is the level of apprehension the athlete has upon return to play. So if they're apprehensive or fearful when they're going back onto the field after playing, that has a huge correlation with the likelihood that they will re-tear. And that's all because if you're apprehensive, that leads to physiological tension. It probably leads to mental distraction. So they're not focused, they're tense, and they're actually putting themselves at higher risk through having that apprehension. And so if you think that from a coach's perspective, from an athlete's perspective, and from a sports psychologist's perspective, it's working on confidence. It's giving them making sure they're actually getting to a point where they feel like they're probably going to feel the fear, but how are they going to still dive in head first and actually commit to like giving 100% performance. And so I think some of those reminders of yes, it's very normal to feel fear and to feel scared, but the safest thing that you can do is to like think about your, like, be competitive, think about your performance, and really really give 100%. And if they are overly apprehensive, then honestly, depending on like the severity of the injury, like maybe they have to stay in that practice environment a little bit more until they've gained the confidence in their ability to enter that competitive arena.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think that covers all of the questions that we either received ahead of time or got through the chat box. If there are any last questions, feel free to put them in the chat box now. Otherwise, feel free to sign off. But thank you again for giving a wonderful talk and sharing all of those great ideas with us.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. It was great to be here tonight.
And I see we're getting a whole bunch of thank yous in the chat box.
That's great. You have a good turnout here. I'm impressed.
Yeah, and I know there were some more registrants. We were at a little over 150, but I also know a lot of people like to see the recording.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think when we get the word out and tell people it was a great talk, hopefully we'll have a whole bunch more looking at that recording.
Okay. Well, if there's nothing else you need from me, I'm going to go eat my dinner.
All right. Yeah, I think we are all set.
Okay.
And I'll be reaching out to you shortly. But yeah, thank you again,
Okay.
and have a great evening.
Okay. Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.